share these words with you as we begin. Exodus 3:5. For you who follow along, in a few moments, we're going to look at Exodus 3:1 through 6. Exodus 3:1 through 6. But I just want to start right now with verse 5. Remove the sandals from your feet. This is God speaking to Moses. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is what? Is holy ground. In other words, God here is saying to him, and this is kind of a difficult time in Moses' life. He's trying to figure things out. He's kind of run away from God's will for him. And now God is pursuing him, coming to him, drawing him back into that. I think we can call this a wilderness experience as we've been speaking to our lives throughout this series. Here God is saying to Moses that now that God has entered into his life, entered into his wilderness, so to speak, he's telling him that now that because he has done that, Moses' very life is now becoming what? Holy ground. And it's that part of his story that we want to take a look at today, especially as it relates to our personal stories. For the past few weeks, we've been talking about in this series how our lives are often like a wilderness, or at least part of them, full of some things that we struggle with, some things that are difficult to deal with. And let me just say to any of you here, to any of you online, if you had to miss any of the last few sermons in this series, I encourage you to go online, go deeper into what we're talking about in terms of working through a wilderness. But having talked about those things, how we have that in our lives, once again today, looking at Moses here, just as he needed God to enter into that space in his life, we've said over and over, we need that as well. And so knowing that God has begun to create some new growth in you, so many of you, as you've been trying to clear space for God in your life, in your wilderness, in the midst of this season of Lent, we really talked about that new growth 2 weeks ago. Knowing that God's been growing you, here's our question for today. How can we now begin to consecrate that new growth to God? Or how can we now begin to, much like Moses is about to do, how can we now begin to dedicate that new growth to a sacred purpose? Let's come back to Moses for a moment. Imagine just an ordinary day in his life, ordinary work day. And on that ordinary work day, Moses chooses to mix it up a little bit by taking the herd, by leading his sheep deeper into the wilderness than he normally does, so to speak. And so having taken his sheep all the way out to Mount Horeb, he now has this encounter with God. Here is now Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Exodus 3, verses 1 through 6. If you want to follow along at home or here in your own Bibles on your phone, this will also be up on the screen. Listen to what we find here. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. Now maybe you've experienced this at one point in your life, maybe especially, living in this area, because sadly enough, we find this when more homes are going in. And I know for those of you that have been around orange groves all your lives, that can break your heart, right? But several years ago, I was driving by an orange grove that had been bulldozed. And now the trees were all piled up and they were being burned. And I assure you, I promise you that as the trees were burning, creating these massive columns of smoke, I assure you that while that pile was burning, it was getting smaller and smaller and smaller, right? Because that's how things are supposed to work when they're on fire. And so for Moses, because this wasn't happening, I mean, of course, he's shocked, but also a bit curious. Verse 4. When the Lord saw that he, Moses, had gone over to look, meaning when God saw that he now had Moses' full attention. When the Lord saw that Moses had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. Message within the message. When we're seeking God out, it's when he'll best be able to call out to us and we'll hear him. Moses comes close to the bush, wondering what is going on. God calls out to him. Moses says, here I am. God then says, do not come any closer. Now we come back to where we started. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. At this, as Moses hears this, what does he do? He hides his face because he was afraid to look at God. I want you to notice this initially. As soon as Moses recognizes the enormity of this moment, what does he do first? Hides his face, right? And that is so important for us because that's always got to be a part of, a foundational part of our being able to consecrate our lives to God, dedicate each day to a sacred purpose. That's so important for us to notice that here because all he's doing in essence when he hides his face is this: he's completely humbling himself before God. Totally in a physical way as well as deep within, humbling himself before God. And because we see that here, here's what we've got to remember. What we're talking about today when we talk about consecration, man, that involves humility as well. Important image here for us. Guys, I don't know if you found this to be true, but gosh, I have, and I think so many have. Usually when God shows up in our lives, and I know he's done that for so many of you because you've been clearing space for him in the midst of Lent, in the midst of your wilderness. I bet so many of you have found as well, usually when God shows up in our lives, ready to call us to action, often the only thing that can get in the way of us hearing him is this: not having a humble spirit within us, or not having a face that's bowed down to him. And so again, as we think about consecration today, as we talk about dedicating the new growth he's creating in us to God, as we talk about that, as we think about that, we're also thinking about humility, and we'll touch on that a little bit more later. Today, as we begin our journey into Holy Week, knowing that that's our foundation as we begin. Today, as we begin this journey, we're going to take a look at some of the things that are just ahead for us. And we're going to look at these key moments, these key events in the lives of Jesus and his disciples. We're going to take a look at these events for this reason. Because when we embrace them, when we put ourselves in them, when we fully take a look at them and just think, okay, this is a key part, not just of their walk, but of my walk as well. When we do that, these moments can't help but humble us. And so let's take a look at these today. Things that we're going to encounter this week. Here's a first stop along the way. Think of these that way. Here's a first stop along the way during this Holy Week. The Last Supper. And the Last Supper here, this last meal that Jesus shares with his disciples prior to his death, this first stop this Last Supper brings along with it this initially, the gift of remembering, the gift of the importance of remembering. And let me just say for a moment, as we enter into this week, you have some stops along the way that you can take beyond just worship if you want to grow in your Holy Week journey. On Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday at 10 a.m. and at 6:30 p.m. on campus here, Laura Rector, our Director of Discipleship, is going to have a study. 3 days in a row, either 10 a.m., 6:30 p.m., man, that's going to take you deeper into the meaning of all of this we're journeying into. Thursday night, Monday, Thursday service, when we talk about the Last Supper, we're going to receive on that night as we remember. We'll receive communion together. On Friday, another stop along the way, Laura will be here in the sanctuary at noon, at 3 p.m., and we're going to move through the Stations of the Cross. And then next week, again, right here for you guys, 9:30 worship, will be extra special. So as I think about even the Last Supper now, know that that's a part of even our journey physically as we move through this week. Again, a first stop along the way as we ponder the biblical story, we think about what God has done for us, is the Last Supper. And the Last Supper, again, brings with it this gift, the gift of remembering. Think back for a moment to that final meal. We find it described in the Gospel of Luke, beginning with verse 7 of chapter 22. Listen to what we find here. Luke 22, starting with verse 7, says this: Then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, Go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover. Let's now drop down to verse 14. When the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table, and he said to them, I've eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God. And then the last two verses we're going to look at here, verses 19 and 20. And he, Jesus, and he took the bread, gave thanks and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. And again, the implication here is this: when you do this, simply put, I want you to remember, I want you to be reminded of, not just the disciples in that moment, but saying to us even now, I want you to be reminded of the enormity of what God has done for you, his grace, his unconditional love. Remember this. Prior to COVID and things shutting down back in March, almost exactly a year ago, we were in the midst of Lent at that time. Prior to us stopping most of what we did in person, a group of Lake Howard Heights residents and we'd gather a couple times a month on Thursday mornings just to enjoy some Bible study, some fellowship. Do know if you were watching today, we're working to make that happen again very soon. But prior to our stopping that meeting together, and looking ahead to Monday, Thursday, again, we were in the midst of Lent, we asked this question and answered it at one point. The question being this: what does sharing in Holy Communion mean to us? What does it really mean to us? And the answer that was pretty much shared by all was that communion meant so much to us because it reminded us of just that, what God had done while we were yet sinners. That remembering that also led us to remember, again, the enormity of this act, the enormity of the cross, the enormity of that unconditional love. With the upper room before you initially today, ask yourself this and really think about this a bit. I've got a couple of examples that I hope will make a little more sense if it doesn't initially. But I think this is so important. And with this, even as you hear me say it now and you might begin to reflect today, in the week ahead, continue to process through this and think about this. With the upper room before you, ask yourself this: what is it you personally need to remember right now, in addition to remembering his body broken for you, remembering his blood shed for you? As important as that is, as much as you must continue to remember that and give thanks for that, as important as that is, what else is it that you personally and uniquely need to remember right now in order to better dedicate to a sacred purpose that which God is doing in you, that which God is growing in you? A couple of examples. I wonder if you've ever thought of it this way before. I don't know if I have. An example of that for Peter, something that I think, man, he's got to remember, that he might more truly dedicate his life to God in Christ. An example of that for Peter might be his need to remember his denials of Christ in the courtyard. Because remembering those things, I think, far from depressing him, man, remembering those things, I think, if he remembers them in the right way, that actually could just fuel his desire to grow in his faith, because what does he know? He knows he doesn't want that to happen again, right? Or maybe for someone like Zacchaeus, the one who climbed a tree in order to see this Jesus, curious about him. An example for him maybe might be his coming down from the tree in order to invite Jesus to his home, because whenever he remembered that day, that action he took, whenever he remembered that might be what really strengthened his commitment to continue to faithfully follow Christ. Again, with those examples, and maybe that's helpful, again, ask yourself with this first thought: when it comes to remembering, what do you personally, it's going to be unique, what do you personally right now need to remember in order to more fully consecrate your life to God, dedicate new growth to a sacred purpose? Second stop along the way, just very shortly after that time in the upper room, second stop along the way during this Holy Week is the Garden of Gethsemane. And while the Last Supper conjures up the gift of remembering, the garden draws us into something very different, but just as important, just as critical, in that here's what we need to take away from this second stop today: the gift of holy fear, the gift of holy fear. Think for a moment about the time that Jesus spends in the Garden of Gethsemane, just hours before his arrest. Here's how it's described to us in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew chapter 26, 36 to 44. Matthew 26, 36 to 44. Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to them, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Don't miss this. Then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Guys, not just divine, but human, right? Going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed. Again, think of Moses hiding his face. Jesus, even in this moment, it says, went a little further, fell with his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken away from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked Peter. Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. He went away a second time and prayed. Second time, my Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away, implied in that is, I wouldn't mind if you did take it away. My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done. When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. Last verse. So he left them and went away once more and prayed the third time, saying the same thing. Guys, I want you to picture Jesus here. Here in the garden, he is beginning to process fully human and divine. He's beginning to process fully what is just ahead. And as he prays over that, I think it's safe to say, for all of us, it's safe to say, there are a lot of intense emotions that are churning within him, right? Even to some degree, a measure of what? Measure of fear, human and divine. I think we find a bit of that being expressed here in prayer as Jesus 3 times offers a prayer like this to God. And I paraphrase, Lord, if you would, take this task from me. But if taking this task from me keeps me from being able to fully consecrate my life to your sacred purpose for me, then don't take the task away, take my fear away. Take my trepidation away. Take my hesitancy away. And fill me with that divine courage that, of course, is in me. I share that and I focus there with this second thought for this reason. If we think dedicating our lives to a greater purpose, or if we think allowing God to turn where we stand into holy ground, if we think, ready? If we think that is nothing to be fearful about, even though we have a glimpse of this in the garden, right? If we don't feel at least a measure of fear when it comes to being used by God, then probably, and let me say it this strongly, then probably we are caught up in a very superficial walk with Christ. Are you with me? And that superficiality is always going to be something that gets in the way of what? Our dedicating our life, our growth to a sacred purpose. Now, conversely, important as that is, conversely, this is also true though. If we feel too much fear in the face of something God is calling us to take on, if we feel too much fear when it comes to dedicating our lives to a sacred purpose, if that's the case, then that too can really get in our way. And so again, here's another key step when it comes to true consecration, consecrating our lives to God. Admitting our fear, yes, but also courageously with God's help, moving through it, not getting stuck there. So with this second thought before you today, ask yourself this as well. Instead of letting fear get in the way of your dedicating your life to God, how might you instead simply let that fear do this? Push you into God's presence all the more in the midst of what you're striving to do for Him. Why not let that fear simply do this? Push you to rely on God all the more each step you take. Man, think about when we were kids. What did we do with our fear when we were laying in bed and we weren't sure about things? I mean, we cried out to mom or dad, right? That fear wasn't something we tried to just deal with on our own. It caused us to rely all the more on those people in our life. Why not, instead of being paralyzed by fear, hiding it, letting it overwhelm us, just allow it to drive us where it should drive us, into God's arms, that we might rely Him all the more. Holy fear. And then there's a final stop along the way during this Holy Week, a stop at the cross, right? Because while the upper room and the garden help us to more fully embrace the gift of remembering, the gift of holy fear, here's what the cross reminds us of, specifically related to consecration. The cross reminds us of this, that while crucifixion always involves the giving up of one's personal life, consecration always involves the giving up of one's personal wants and desires. In other words, the gift that the cross brings along with it is this, the gift of sacrifice. The gift of sacrifice. Not just a gift given for us, but that gift that we are to strive to live into each day as well. Let me say more about that. Meister Eckhart, a 14th century Christian mystic, writes this related to that. Think of sacrifice, the gift of sacrifice, that which Jesus offered, God in Christ offered, that which we're called to. Hear these words, I love them. He writes, the spiritual life is not so much a process of addition as a process of subtraction. In other words, the closer we wish to come to God, the more of our carefully constructed selves we need to give up. Giving up our illusions, our defenses, our selfish personal goals, and our carefully designed sense of who we're supposed to be or who we think we're supposed to be. Guys, truth is, in the end, to really consecrate the new growth that God has brought up in us in the midst of this season of Lent as we've been clearing space for Him in our wilderness. In the end, that's always going to come down to this, to setting aside some lesser things so that we might instead begin to more fully embrace that which is holy. Setting aside, for example, a focus on self so that we might instead focus on others. Or setting aside, for example, a focus on self-preservation so that we might instead focus on what? Living a life of sacrifice. John Henry Jowett once said this, and man, this is not about finances. This is not about that. It's about so many other things. And we've got to always keep that front and center as a church, ministry teams, leadership team, all of us as individual disciples walking here at Beamer. What a great thought. He writes, ministry that costs nothing, accomplishes nothing, sacrifice. That speaks so beautifully, so perfectly to this final thought today, because as tough as it is, and it is, as tough as it is to truly embrace sacrifice, live into a life of sacrifice, man, without that, we're never going to be able to what? Truly dedicate our lives to God, to the sacred purpose He has for us. One of the things that makes Holy Week so special, I mean, it's different than that week leading up to Christmas, right? One of the things that makes Holy Week so special, beginning today, is connected to these stops along the way, entry into Jerusalem, and then all that we're about to find beyond this day. As you enter into this week, begin to prepare your hearts even now, and I encourage you, print out what you'll find online. It will help you to walk through these days. But even now, either way, begin to prepare your heart to so that you might intentionally do just what we've talked about today. Remember, along with the disciples, what you must remember most as a Christ follower, the enormity of the gift. And walk through your fear along with Jesus, that more and more it might be turned into holy fear as you give it to God. Let it motivate you. But then lastly, sacrifice. Give your all to God this week and beyond. as he's given his all to you. I pray this is a great week for you and for me. Let's pray.